For so long, Clint Eastwood stayed silent, while the world only saw the tough guy icon and his rising star son making his own way. But now at 95, the legendary director and actor finally speaks about Scott with a vulnerability few have witnessed. The words are raw, tender, and filled with the weight of time. This is his truth. The man behind the squint and the steely gaze, the filmmaker who redefined American cinema, now turns his lens inward to the relationship that matters most. Stay with us. What happens next will change how you see one of Hollywood's most guarded father-son relationships and reveals what it truly means to leave a legacy that runs deeper than fame. Icons like Clint Eastwood aren't supposed to crack. For decades, he's embodied a stoic American ideal, the man of few words, the unflinching hero, the director who commands sets with quiet authority. His transformation from TV cowboy to Dirty Harry to Oscar-winning filmmaker forms one of Hollywood's most remarkable arcs. But behind every icon is a human being, and behind every director is someone trying to direct their own life. What does it mean when a man who built a career on emotional restraint finally opens up about his son? What changes when the rugged individualist acknowledges the continuation of his legacy? For Scott Eastwood, building a career in his father's long shadow hasn't been simple. The public has often viewed him through the lens of comparison, the strong jawline, the squinted eyes, the measured speech. But what of the private conversations? What of the guidance given, or perhaps withheld? This story matters because it speaks to something universal. Fathers and sons, legacies passed down, words left unsaid until time forces them into the open. In an industry built on facades, authentic connection remains the rarest currency of all. Clint Eastwood Jr. was born May 31, 1930, in San Francisco during the Great Depression, a beginning that would shape his no-nonsense worldview. His family moved frequently as his father searched for work, an early lesson in impermanence that perhaps contributed to Clint's lifelong resistance to putting down roots. By the time he was drafted into the Army in 1951, Eastwood had developed the quiet self-reliance that would become his trademark, both on and off screen. Hollywood found him almost by accident. While serving at Fort Ord, a fellow soldier with connections suggested he meet a director. Eastwood, with his 6'4" frame and distinctive features, had a presence that translated to camera, though few could have predicted the staying power that would follow. In 1954, he signed a contract with Universal Studios, his first step into an industry that would eventually bow to his vision. Meanwhile, in a parallel beginning that wouldn't intersect with Clint's story until decades later, Scott Eastwood entered the world on March 21, 1986, born to flight attendant Jocelyn Reeves, with whom Clint had a relationship while separated. From actress Sandra Locke, Scott's early years weren't defined by Hollywood royalty. Growing up primarily in Hawaii, young Scott Clinton Reeves, as he was known then, experienced a childhood removed from his father's spotlight, a beginning that would eventually shape his own approach to the industry and to the Eastwood name he would later adopt. The distance, both geographic and emotional, between father and son during these formative years would set the stage for a relationship marked by both independence and inevitable comparison. But here's where it gets complicated. Unlike many Hollywood legacies, this one began with separation rather than proximity. By the time Scott was born, Clint Eastwood had already reinvented himself several times over. From the taciturn cowboy Rowdy Yates in Rawhide, 1959 to 1965, to the enigmatic man with no name in Sergio Leone's spaghetti westerns, and then to the gritty urban vigilante Harry Callahan who uttered the immortal line, "Go ahead, make my day." Eastwood had cemented himself as an American icon. The 1970s and 80s saw Clint expanding beyond acting, stepping behind the camera with increasing frequency and ambition. In 1971, he directed his first feature, Play Misty for Me, revealing an instinct for storytelling that would eventually earn him Hollywood's highest honors. These were also years of personal complexity, multiple relationships, children from different partnerships, and a public persona that revealed little of his private world. On set, Eastwood developed a directorial style as economical as his acting. Get it done, move on became his mantra. No unnecessary takes, no wasted motion. A cinematographer once described watching Eastwood direct as witnessing someone conduct an orchestra with the slightest movements of his hands. This efficiency earned him the industry's respect, even as it perhaps reflected his approach to emotional expression in his personal life. While Clint was redefining his career through films like Unforgiven and The Bridges of Madison County in the 1990s, Scott was entering adolescence, forming his identity in relation to, and sometimes in spite of, the towering figure his father had become. And that's when everything changed. Scott's journey toward his father's profession wasn't immediate or inevitable. Unlike many children of Hollywood royalty, he wasn't ushered onto red carpets as a child or given easy access to starring roles. In fact, according to interviews Scott has given over the years, Clint made it clear early on there would be no shortcuts, no favors, no trading on the Eastwood name. "My dad was pretty old school," Scott revealed in a 2015 interview with Esquire. "I've heard some people say that my dad is tough to work for. But he wasn't really tough on me. I mean, he made me work hard like everybody else, but he treated me like everybody else." The father-son relationship took a significant turn when Scott, after attending college in California, decided to pursue acting. Around 2003, Scott began appearing in small roles, sometimes using his mother's last name, Reeves, to avoid the appearance of nepotism. His first appearance in one of his father's films came with 2008's Gran Torino, where he played a background character. No special treatment, no showcase moment. The set of Gran Torino offered a glimpse into their professional dynamic. Crew members noted how Clint addressed his son exactly as he did every other actor: direct, economical, with both praise and criticism. During one scene, when Scott delivered a line with particular authenticity, Clint simply nodded and moved on to the next setup. No public acknowledgement of their connection, no special recognition. To everyone watching, it might have seemed cold, but within the Eastwood ethic, it was perhaps the highest form of respect. "I've seen my dad direct for a long time," Scott later said, "and he does this thing where he just looks at you and goes." Scott would mimic his father's signature squint and subtle nod, the minimalist gesture that meant the take was good. But here's where it gets complicated. That same gesture, so affirming on a film set, can feel insufficient in the context of a father-son relationship. The public narrative around Clint and Scott Eastwood has largely centered on images, side-by-side photographs highlighting their uncanny resemblance. Scott recreating his father's iconic poses from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, both men embodying a similar brand of rugged masculinity across different eras. The visual shorthand became so common that when Scott appeared in 2015's The Longest Ride, many critics focused less on his performance and more on how much he reminded them of a young Clint. What we think we know about their relationship has been shaped by carefully curated public moments and press junket soundbites. When Scott joined the cast of Suicide Squad and began landing leading roles, the questions inevitably followed. What advice did your father give you? How involved is he in your career? Are you trying to follow in his footsteps? The narrative seems simple. Legendary father, son following the path, Hollywood dynasty continuing. But off camera, the story was different. In a quiet corner of Clint's Malpaso Productions office in 2016, a moment unfolded that few witnessed. Scott had stopped by after a screen test for a major action franchise. The pressure had been immense, not just to perform well, but to step out from under the weight of comparison. According to a longtime assistant who was present, Clint watched Scott describe the audition, listened without interruption, then simply placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You know," Clint said after a long pause, "I never had to deal with being somebody's son." That single sentence, acknowledging the unique challenge Scott faced, spoke volumes coming from a man famous for his economy of words. It wasn't recorded for publicity, wasn't crafted for a documentary. It was simply a father recognizing his son's individual journey. The same year, when both appeared in Esquire magazine, Clint at 86, Scott at 30, their parallel interviews revealed the respectful distance that defined their relationship. Scott spoke of learning to man up and take personal responsibility, lessons clearly influenced by his father. Clint spoke of his pride in Scott's work ethic, noting that his son had taken my name, but he's taken it in a different direction. What no one saw coming was how this measured public dynamic would eventually give way to something more vulnerable as time, that most relentless of directors, forced a new scene neither had scripted. The father-son narrative we've been sold through magazine profiles and talk show anecdotes only scratches the surface. The complications begin with Scott's childhood. The fact that he was born to Jocelyn Reeves during a time when Clint was in a long-term relationship with actress Sandra Locke. Scott grew up primarily in Hawaii, away from Hollywood's glare, but also away from consistent contact with his father. "I came from nothing, and I didn't have a lot growing up," Scott told Men's Health in 2017, a statement that surprised many who assumed Clint's son would have enjoyed a privileged upbringing. The reality was more nuanced. While Scott wasn't raised in poverty, he also wasn't given the red carpet treatment. He worked as a bartender, a construction worker, and a parking valet before finding traction as an actor. The complications extend to Scott's decision to take on the Eastwood name professionally. According to those close to the situation, this wasn't a decision made lightly or early. Scott was in his 20s when he adopted his father's surname for his acting career. What looked to outsiders like an obvious advantage carried emotional weight for both men. For Scott, it meant embracing a legacy while risking being forever seen as Clint's son rather than his own man. For Clint, it meant watching his son voluntarily step into the shadow he had cast. Then there's the professional dynamic. While Scott has appeared in several of his father's films, Flags of Our Fathers, Gran Torino, and Invictus among them, these have mostly been small roles. Clint has never cast Scott as a lead, a decision that speaks to the elder Eastwood's commitment to meritocracy, but has also fueled speculation about his reluctance to be seen playing favorites. "I've auditioned for pretty much every one of my father's movies," Scott revealed in a 2017 interview, adding that he was rejected for many of them. This professional boundary created a unique pressure. Imagine trying to prove yourself to a director who is not only one of Hollywood's most respected filmmakers, but also your father. Industry insiders have noted the careful distance both men maintained professionally. On sets where both were present, Clint was known to treat Scott with the same direct, no-nonsense approach he used with all actors. No special attention, no fatherly asides. This professional stoicism earned respect, but may have complicated their personal connection. As Scott's star rose with films like The Longest Ride and Pacific Rim Uprising, he found himself constantly fielding questions about his famous father, questions that often overshadowed discussion of his own work. Meanwhile, Clint continued his remarkable late-career renaissance with films like American Sniper and Richard Jewell, maintaining his position as one of cinema's elder statesmen. Father and son moved in parallel orbits, connected yet separate, each carrying the weight of the Eastwood name in different ways. Now, if you're wondering whether this professional separation reflected personal distance, that's where the story becomes even more complex. Time creates its own narrative arc. And the years following Scott's emergence as an actor in his own right brought both evolution and reflection to the Eastwood legacy. By 2018, Scott had established himself beyond the Clint's Son label with leading roles in major productions, while Clint, entering his late 80s, continued defying Hollywood's ageism with critically acclaimed directorial efforts like The Mule and Richard Jewell. The distance between them, once perhaps necessary for Scott's independent development, began to shift as both men entered new phases of life. For Scott, hitting his mid-30s brought a deeper appreciation for his father's journey. For Clint, advancing age naturally prompted reflection on relationships and legacy. A quiet scene unfolded in 2019 at Clint's Carmel home, away from cameras and journalists. According to a longtime family friend, Scott had brought over a print of his latest film, not seeking professional validation, but simply sharing his work. Clint, who normally watches films in his private screening room, instead sat in his living room beside his son. For over 2 hours, they viewed the movie in near silence, occasionally exchanging observations about particular shots or performance choices. When the film ended, Scott waited for his father's assessment, the director's cut, so to speak. Clint was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "You know," he finally said, "you've got your own eye now." I can see it. Coming from Clint Eastwood, a filmmaker known for his distinctive visual style and economy, this observation carried weight beyond its simple phrasing. It acknowledged Scott not as an extension of himself, but as an artist with his own perspective. The exchange wasn't reported in entertainment news or shared on social media. It existed in that private space where relationships evolve away from public consumption. And that's when everything changed. As Clint moved into his 90s, continuing to work with remarkable energy and clarity, subtle shifts appeared in how both men spoke about each other. In interviews, Scott began referencing conversations with his father that went beyond professional advice to life wisdom. Clint, while maintaining his characteristic reserve, occasionally allowed glimpses of paternal pride to emerge beyond his usual measured statements. A documentary filmmaker who interviewed Clint in 2021 noted how the director's expression softened noticeably when Scott's name came up. A micro-expression that spoke volumes from a man who built a career on controlling his emotional presentation on screen. The professional distance remained. Scott continued forging his path without trading heavily on his father's influence. But the emotional landscape was shifting with the quiet inevitability that comes when time itself becomes a character in the story. The pivotal moment came in early 2025 as Clint Eastwood approached his 95th birthday. After wrapping his 40th directorial feature, an achievement few filmmakers reach even in their prime, Clint agreed to a rare in-depth interview for a retrospective on his career. What began as a discussion of his filmmaking evolved into something more profound when the conversation turned to family and legacy. "I've always been better with cameras than conversations," Clint acknowledged, with the kind of self-awareness that comes from decades of reflection. "That's probably cost me some things over the years." When the interviewer brought up Scott's recent critical success, a performance that had earned industry recognition in its own right, something shifted in Clint's demeanor. The characteristic reserve gave way to an expression rarely captured on camera. Unguarded pride. Watching Scott find his way. "It's been different than I expected," Clint said. "When he was younger, I kept my distance professionally. Thought it would be better for him to make his own name. Maybe that was right, maybe it wasn't. But I didn't want him to have the burden of being Eastwood's kid more than he already did." Clint paused, his gaze drifting momentarily before he continued. "The thing about being a father is you're always learning the job, even when your kids are grown. I look at Scott now, the choices he makes, as an actor, as a man, and I see things I wish I'd done differently, and things I'm damn glad I didn't mess up." This wasn't the scripted response of a publicity tour or the careful navigation of a joint father-son interview. It was Clint Eastwood at 95, allowing himself a vulnerability that his on-screen personas rarely permitted. The filmmaker, who had spent decades capturing human emotion through his lens, was finally turning the camera inward. "We had a conversation last year," Clint continued. "Scott asked me if I'd ever worried about him following me into this business. I told him the truth, that I'd worried about it being harder for him because of me, not easier, that people would always be looking for me in him." According to those present for the interview, Clint's voice took on a quality rarely heard in his public speaking, a gentle rawness that conveyed emotion without theatrics. What I didn't say then, but wish I had, was how watching him find his own way despite all that, it's been one of the greatest privileges of my life. The interview, published in conjunction with Clint's 95th birthday, revealed a side of the filmmaker that decades of profiles had never captured. Not a dramatic confession or a sentimental display, but something more authentic. A father acknowledging the complicated journey of watching his son navigate a path both illuminated and shadowed by his own legacy. Stay with us, because what followed would add yet another dimension to this evolving story. What makes Clint Eastwood's reflections on his relationship with Scott so powerful isn't their sentimentality. Clint has never trafficked in easy emotion, but their honesty. At 95, the filmmaker has earned the right to look back without the protective filters that once served his career and privacy. "There's a myth about legacy in this business," Clint noted in a follow-up conversation after his birthday, "that it's about name recognition or who you know. The real legacy is what you learn about yourself along the way. what you wish you'd done differently, and what you'd do exactly the same. For Scott, now in his late 30s with a substantial career of his own, his father's public acknowledgement represented not validation, he'd earned that himself, but a closing of an emotional circle. In his own interview shortly after Clint's revelations, Scott offered his perspective on growing up Eastwood. People assume it was this amazing advantage being his son, Scott reflected, and in some ways, sure. But in the ways that matter when you're figuring out who you are, it complicated things. For a long time, I was trying to either live up to the name or get out from under it. What I've learned, what I think we both learned, is that neither approach works. You just have to be authentically yourself. This mutual recognition, father and son each acknowledging the other's individual journey, reframes the Eastwood legacy beyond the simplistic narrative of Hollywood dynasty. It speaks to something more universal, the complex terrain between fathers and sons, between admiration and independence, between legacy and self-determination. Film historians have noted how Clint's later directorial work has increasingly explored themes of regret, redemption, and reckoning with the past, from Unforgiven to Gran Torino to Cry Macho. These aren't simply the preoccupations of an aging filmmaker, but the authentic concerns of a man examining the arc of his life, including his role as a father. Scott, meanwhile, has evolved from being visually compared to a young Clint to establishing his own screen presence. Critics have noted his growth as an actor who brings emotional nuance to roles that might have once seemed solely physical. This parallel artistic evolution, Clint delving deeper into human complexity as a director, while Scott explores similar territory as an actor, suggests a legacy transmitted not through nepotism, but through shared values about storytelling and authenticity. What emerges now is not the mythology of the Eastwood name, but something more valuable. The truth of a relationship that has weathered distance, comparison, and the pressures of public scrutiny to arrive at mutual respect and genuine connection. The truth is quieter than the headlines. It lives in the spaces between public statements, in the choices made across decades, in the hard-earned wisdom that comes from navigating one of Hollywood's most scrutinized father-son relationships with integrity intact. We began with silence, the space between a father and son navigating fame, legacy, and identity in an industry that mythologizes both. Now at 95, Clint Eastwood has found words for what perhaps needed no explanation between them, but deserved acknowledgement beyond them. That the greatest achievements aren't measured in Oscars or box office returns, but in the authentic connections we forge despite the complications of our past. In the quiet of Clint's Carmel home, father and son recently watched the sunset together. Two men with the same profile against the fading light. No cameras captured the moment. No interviews preserved their conversation. But in that private space, the legacy continued. Not the legacy of Hollywood royalty, but of two individuals who found their way to each other through the noise of expectation and comparison. What moment in this story resonated most with you? Was it Clint's acknowledgement of the burden his name placed on his son? Scott's journey to establish himself beyond comparison? Or perhaps that quiet recognition between two filmmakers who happen to share the same blood? Share your thoughts and remember, behind every icon is a human story still being written.